Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you for coming to the forum. This forum is sponsored by the Legislative Committee of the Winfield and Ark City Chambers of Commerce and Winfield Publishing Company. We'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank both candidates for being here, Representative Ed Trimmer and Larry Alley. Our format this evening is to give each candidate 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we will have questions. That I have been given several questions, so I appreciate that. We will have questions that I will ask that will each be given 3 minutes to discuss the questions. I've addressed already to both candidates we can be a little bit flexible about time. If they feel there's something they really need to expand on or something like that, we can allow that, but we do want to get as many topics in front of us as we can. One thing I would like to say that my attitude of what I'm going to try to be doing here today will be to get as many issues as we can in front of the candidates and get a chance for them to speak on them. There are a lot of questions, and some of them are specific to people, and some of them are specific to issues. I will try to get as many issues as we can in front of them. I'm going to change the wording in a lot of the questions to make sure that it's put that way so that both candidates can respond to the questions. But trying to get most of the issues in front is the main point of what we want to try to do, and give the candidates a chance to make sure that they can talk about their positions. So with that said, we will get started, and we will start with our incumbent and ask Representative Trimmer. Ed, if you would please give your 5-minute opening statement.
Yeah, that might work. I think we can get it to work here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I would like to thank the Winfield and Ark City Chambers for holding this event, and also Southwestern College for providing the facility. As a legislator, I've made it my personal goal to look at all sides of an issue. I want to make sure that I understand how all legislation is going to affect the citizens of the district. I don't look at just a brief that somebody hands me. I do my own research to find out what an issue is about, because I trust, but I also verify. I also make it a point, and this is from my debate training, and all the time I was a debate coach, I taught my students, to understand the cause-effect relationships of legislation. In other words, not just the topic of a bill, but what it's actually going to do. I don't vote on the topic of a bill alone. I look at what the bill actually does. Now, you've seen some negative mailers that accuse me of voting this way or that way on a piece of legislation. I may agree with some parts of that legislation and not other parts, but I look at the entirety of the piece of legislation and whether it's a well-crafted bill and whether it has unintended consequences. And I make sure that I make a good decision about that piece of legislation. I don't just vote because of its topic. I don't vote on gotcha points. In other words, if the bill has a gotcha point in it, that doesn't matter. I make sure it's a good bill. And as we go through this debate, you're probably going to hear some examples of that as we talk about some of the issues. I try to keep my constituents informed. I have listening tours in all my communities. I do newsletters frequently. I have news articles in the paper every year. And I do a lot of email correspondence for constituents, and I try to get back to constituents immediately when I get an email from them. Constituent services are very important to me because that's one of the parts of my job. Now, I also believe this. How you campaign is an indication of how you will serve as a legislator. If you are negative, if you misconstrue information, if you distort what your fellow legislator says, or if you use labels or name-calling or unfair accusations, that doesn't help you get things passed in the legislature. It doesn't help you be bipartisan, and it doesn't help you be an effective policymaker. So I try to be positive, and you're going to hear in a little bit, well, Ed Trimmer is partisan. He voted 95% of the time with the Democrats. We'll get to that a little bit later, but also voted 80% of the time with the majority of Republicans, because we all vote together on most everything because it's unanimous. So there are very few things we disagree on. But the one thing I can tell you is that you'll be hard-pressed to find any vote that I took this year that didn't have Republicans voting the same way. So I don't just go off in a corner and vote with Democrats. So I made a pledge each election cycle to stay positive, not use labels, to take a bipartisan approach to my job, and develop positive relationships with my fellow legislators. I heard Cassia Kelly at the last forum say that you look at the responsibility the legislature is given to determine how effective they are in Topeka. And I have one of the largest workloads of any legislator. I have 7 different committees. I've been on a myriad of subcommittees, and I do a lot of work in committee because that's where most of the work is actually done when you craft legislation. I've been accused of being ineffective because I didn't get things passed. Most of the bills I introduce are committee bills, and I work on them in committee. I help get them through committees, and that's how we do legislation. But I've also been accused of being so influential that I've just screwed Topeka up. Well, I'm a chef, and I've spoiled the kitchen. You know, I've ruined the meal. Well, those two things can't be true. I'm either effective or I'm not. But I would tell you this. When you're looking at what's happening in Topeka, if you don't like it, remember that the Democrats haven't been in control, and neither have the moderate Republicans in the last couple of years. What I would say is that, you know, I think we all have a place, Democrats, Republicans, moderates, you know, ultra-conservatives, whatever. I think we all have a place at the table. We should all listen to each other, and we should all work together. That's why I want to continue to be a positive voice for cooperation and reason in Topeka. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Larry, your 5-minute introduction. Let you figure out how that mic will work well for you.
Mic working? No.
No.
1, 2, 3.
Well, we'll try this one. Is that better? Thank you. Good evening. We do have a great crowd out here tonight. I know why. Because the Royals are traveling in the World Series. So thank you for the Winfield and Ark City Chamber. Also thank you for Southwestern College and for the Winfield Courier for hosting this debate. And also I'd like to thank Representative Trimmer and for being here this evening. And I expect a lively discussion on the issues. Most importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here, because you need to take the time to make an informed decision and a thoughtful decision on who you send to Topeka. I spent the last several months visiting with people in Cali and Sumner County about the issues that, what's the most important issue to them. And as we talk to people, they're fed up with the inaction and the gridlock coming from our politicians. I am too, and that's the reason I decided to enter the race. I wouldn't wish a campaign on anybody. It's been a long race. We started this in January. But, you know, I got into the race because the 79th District deserves a lot more than excuses. We deserve to have our voices heard. In my vision, every Kansas child receives a quality education. Jobs are abundant, and more money stays in the pockets of those people that earn it. But I just won't talk about my vision. I'll act to make it a reality. I won't blame the other party. I'll work with them to confront the issues that matter most to Kansas. You know, I had the honor of serving 10 years in the Douglas School Board, and during that time we had to work together to pass pay raises for our teachers. We also had to pass a bond issue to fund district improvements. And we had to work together because there's several people on the board that didn't have the same views that we all had. So we had to work together and find a common ground to get things done. And that's what we were committed to do for our students. And I've been a long-time champion of public education and of local control of public education. You know, I've owned a small business, and job creation is much more than just a buzzword. We've actually done it. We developed a couple subdivisions, and we had to work with, during that time, we had to work with our counties and with our cities and with our community members to complete the project. And we did it because that's what it took to get things done. And I know firsthand how taxation can kill jobs. I believe that taxes, we're talking about property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, shouldn't be a burden to the job creators or to our Kansas family. We want to make sure Kansas can thrive. And my campaign has picked up the endorsement of the Sumner County Farm Bureau, the National Rifle Association, the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, the Kansans for Life, the National Federation of Independent Businessmen, the organization Quality Schools for All Kansas Kids, and countless others. Frankly, the most important endorsement I'm seeking right now is from the voters. Again, thank you for coming, and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question involves the state tax laws. The state has been coming up short on some of its projections earlier and has been and would you please speak about your opinion about how the tax cuts that were enacted are taking place and the effect they will have on our economy? And Larry, we'll let you start with this one first.
You know, I wasn't in the legislature to pass the tax cuts, but I think it's a good thing when you keep more of your money in your pocket. When I'm at Topeka, I'll look for ways to save money, to look at the efficiencies of state government, and I don't want to cut vital services. Kansans understand the efficiencies with budgeting. They also expect the same thing of their elected officials, and that's why I will do in Topeka, look for efficiencies in government and make sure we have great budgeting. It's not perfect, but what it does do, it leaves money in the pockets of the people that earn the money. And as much as Mr. Trimmer doesn't want to admit that, that is a good thing. The overall tax burden in Kansas has decreased, and I will work to ensure that it continues to decrease in a fair fashion. Thank you.
Ed? Thank you. When you talk about taxes and having more money in people's pockets, I don't think that's a bad thing, and I wouldn't hesitate to admit that that's a good thing. But the way we go about it is totally different. And I think when Larry tells you that we need to grow the economy and we need to cut taxes to do it, that's a failed experiment. They tried it during the Reagan administration. They called it trickle-down theory. It didn't work. They've tried it in other states. It hasn't worked. They're trying it in Kansas now, and it still is not working. Now, because I voted against the 2012 tax plan does not mean I voted to increase your taxes. I voted against the massive cuts in taxes that were unnecessary. And I want to talk about that just a little bit. Dwayne Gosen, the Republican House Appropriations Chair, and then the Budget Director for Bill Graves, Kathleen Sebelius, and Mark Parkinson, said that the 2012 tax plan was a plan without any plan. They had no spreadsheet, they had not calculated how it was going to work, and they didn't have any direction for how that was going to work. And as a result, we're going to have the largest deficit that we'll have in state history. We will have lost $3.7 billion in revenue by 2018, and we will be facing a $1.2 billion deficit. Now, in Oxford, Larry said, oh, everybody predicts that we'll have a deficit, and it never really happens. We've been predicting this one, and Dwayne Gosen has predicted this one since we adopted the tax plan, and he's been spot on. He understands what's happening. We are facing a huge deficit. And you can't fund education, you can't fund programs for seniors, you cannot fund necessary highway programs by massively cutting programs. And to say that you're going to be a proponent for education and then support a tax plan that will cut the guts out of education because there will have to be massive cuts is not being that's being disingenuous. Because you cannot do both of those things. You've got to have some revenue. And my question is, when we have tax breaks, that's a good thing. When we know how to target them, for instance, like the PEAK program or something that would allow companies to get tax breaks if they create jobs. But to give businesses like the payday loans who bank their money out of state and prey on our poorest citizens to not have to pay any income tax at all or contribute to our economy, why did we do that? I think we need to look at those kinds of things and ask ourselves, what are we doing and is it really working? If you look at our bond rating, we have had 3 downgrades in our bond rating because of this tax plan, and we have had a myriad of problems. Thank you.
Yes, you can respond. I'll give you about a minute to respond.
You know, Mr. Trimmer has consistently voted against our income tax cuts for our families, for Kansas families. He seems more concerned with padding our state's economy and our revenue number than to let our Kansas people put money in their own pocket. The money belongs to the people. They work hard for it and should be able to keep it. Predicting revenues was particularly challenging this year because of federal tax changes that encouraged some of our investors to shift income from one year to the other. Ladies and gentlemen, these predictions are just what that is. Predictions, estimates, and our best guesses. I believe the best indicator for our future is our past. And as history does repeat itself. Let's look at what happened in 2010 and 2011. The previous Parkinson administration budget that year projected a $292 million shortfall. To make up for that shortfall, the Democrats, including Mr. Trimmer, passed the largest tax increase in state history, $1 billion over 3 years. Even with this record tax increase, at the end of that fiscal year, it was projected only to have an ending balance of $1.4 million. That's not very much when you look at the $6.1 billion budget. Okay. Then, the actual ending balance was a whopping $876.05. The gentleman in charge, the budget administrator in charge of that, was none other than Mr. Dwayne Gosen. He was in charge of that shipwreck. Let's move forward. And
We might wrap it. Okay. We'll get back. You'll have some opportunities to talk a bit more about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, what the tax he talks about wasn't income. It was a sales tax. And you know what? This governor made it permanent. I voted for it for 3 years to get us out of the trouble. And secondly, the governor is now claiming that they had money after this $800 that they had in the bank. By the time he took office, we had $250 million in the bank because of the sales tax. So they didn't grow the economy. That sales tax bailed them out, and they made that permanent. I voted against that. I haven't voted for income tax increases. But I will tell you, what Larry isn't telling you is that according to the governor's own economic council, Kansas lags behind in the last, since the 2012 tax plan, in job growth, per capita income, private industry wages, state domestic product, and population. We are not achieving what they said we would through this tax plan, and it's not getting better. And the projections were made by the Legislative Research Department and the Revenue Estimating Group, which is what we rely on to set our budget.
Next question involves another piece of legislation that was passed earlier. Involves gun control, and would like to have you discuss a little bit about your opinions on the legislation and how it affects specifically the schools that we have in our community, Southwestern College and Cali College. Ed?
Well, to begin with, I was a proponent of concealed carry. I voted to make that legal. I also voted to override the governor's veto. And I have in my information about 6 or 7 different pieces of legislation where I voted for the Second Amendment to gun owners' rights. But the one place I drew the line was I said that government agencies in the local areas should have local control, and they should be allowed to make their own decisions on what they allow into their courthouses. I had a meeting with some of the law enforcement officers in Cali County, and the comment that was made to me was that if we have someone draw a gun in the hallway of the courthouse, which is a very volatile place, especially in divorce proceedings, and other people are there that have concealed carry permits and they draw their guns, if the police walk into that situation, they have no idea who the perpetrator is, and anyone who turns in their direction is going to get shot. It's a problem that we didn't have, but it's going to create a problem that might be worse. I think it's up to the local entities to make that decision. Now, I'm not against concealed carry. I voted for that. I'm not against open carry. I voted for that. But I think college administrators have the right to say, or should have the right to say, they don't now, but should have the right to say that they don't want weapons in the dorm rooms, or they shouldn't have to spend an inordinate amount of money to put scanning devices at every single entrance. There are just some places that would be better to allow local governments to restrict those weapons. If the government doesn't want to do that, then they have that choice. But that's the only place I've really differed on this, and I believe that that is an issue of local control.
right to bear arms has nothing to do with hunting or shooting, target shooting. It has everything to do with free people remaining free. And as a member of NRA, I will stand against any attempt to infringe on our Second Amendment rights, and I fully support concealed carry and support the privacy protections for law-abiding citizens. Again, I have the support of the NRA and the Kansas Rifle Association. Let's talk just a moment about what Mr. Trimmer was talking about, local control. You voted for local control of your Second Amendment rights. You voted to say, Ark City, you can have one group of laws. Winfield, you can have another group of laws. Every local jurisdiction could then infringe on your Second Amendment rights. Ladies and gentlemen, our Second Amendment is guaranteed by our Constitution, and I believe that we should actually make sure that that law stays in effect, and we have that right. Now, as far as these security devices in their corridors and all of that, have there been any of those security devices installed at our college campuses? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question involves school funding. What are your thoughts on funding for local schools, and what can the state do to ensure it provides a quality education while attracting quality teachers and staff? Larry?
First of all, let me say that Kansas has great schools, and we're consistently in the top 5 of the nation. As a former school board member and president, and a proud father of a teacher, and a brother of a public teacher, I know how hard it is, how hard they work. And I know firsthand how important it is to fund our schools. More money should go into our classrooms rather than get caught up in the massive administrative costs. Let's talk about the cost. Kansas spends 67% of our budget on education. 55% of that budget is K through 12, with 11% going to higher education. Now, Kansas has seen a steady increase of overall taxpayer support for our schools and total spending per pupil. And this year it reached a record high. The total funding has increased every year since 2011. And the total spending per child is $13,269 per pupil. And if we multiply that out by 20 for the number of students in the classroom, that's over $250,000 per classroom. Our teachers average about $47 a person, a teacher. $47,000, excuse me. So my question to you, we need to find where that other $200,000 per classroom is going. You know, one of the things that you're going to hear is the base state aid's been cut and all this, but when one uses only a portion of our school funding formula, the base state aid, to represent our total formula, then it kind of distorts the overall picture. There's much more to school finance formula than just base state aid. And we need to take a look at reforming the state finance formula. The best thing that we can do to improve our school district's revenue is improve our economy. And by expanding our private sector job growth and by removing the impediments to our economic activity in Kansas, we'll increase our revenue. Mr. Trimmer voted against increasing our funding for our schools, teacher pay raises, and an $84 million in property tax relief. I will support the improving our schools, and I support these increases in funding. Thank you.
Ed?
Well, this is an example, I think, of where there have been partisan attacks on me because I'm just now being accused of voting against funding for schools. I want you to understand that issue. Steve Abrams voted against the same bill for the same reason. Now, he was praised on the Republican website for being a supporter of our children, but the only difference between the two of us on that vote was I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican. Now, why did he vote against it? For the same reason I did. In the middle of the night, there were a bunch of amendments that were added onto it that did some things we didn't need to do, cutting at-risk funding, cutting transportation funding, doing all kinds of, taking out teacher due process, doing corporation tax breaks for private schools, even if they're not accredited. So there were some bad things. We didn't vote to kill that bill. We supported that bill all the way through as far as the funding and the equalization. We voted to send it back to committee, conference committee, to get it right. We'd already done that once. We were ready to send it back again to get it right. If we want to kill a bill, there's another way to do it. It's not that way. When we talk about a lot of these bills, and they accuse me of voting against them, it's because I vote against the conference committee report because I want to send it back to conference committee and get it right because it's got some bad things in it. And that's what happened here. Now, very quickly, on the 55% of the budget being education, that's because we collect the money from the counties to the state and send it back. Most states don't do that. So we have a high percentage, but it's only because of the way we account it. Now, when Mr. Alley talks about how much we spend per student, it's interesting that he says that we spend over $13,000 per student, but information we got today from the state board, the State Department of Education says it's only $12,959. He's got about a $400 difference there. But here's the other point. That figure since 2012 now includes CAPERS payments, which were never included before. And it also includes bond payments when local districts decide to build buildings. And in the case of like Winfield, if Blue Valley decides to increase their mill levy because they've got their local option budget higher because they were willing to do that than Winfield, that goes into that overall amount, and that overall amount reflects back on us. That's why you need to look at base state aid per pupil to see what your district is getting and what's happening to your district. And base state aid per pupil has had, under the Brownback administration and under what Larry's talking about, the largest single cut in state history, and we're number 4 in the country on how much we've cut that base state aid per pupil. Don't throw in the kitchen sink. Look at what the state actually does to fund public education and not add in all the CAPERS payments that schools can't use. Thank you.
1 minute, please.
We can do it. I didn't hear. No, I thought I had 3 minutes last time. Okay, first of all, the Kansas Legislative Research just put out the paper, $13,269. So the 1314 was $12,960. This comes from Legislative Research, which is bipartisan. Okay, now let's move on to, he referenced Dr. Abrams. Dr. Abrams knows, and he is in the audience, and if I'm saying something wrong, I'm sure he'll correct me later. But Dr. Abrams knew that the bill would not pass. It is true that both Ed and Dr. Abrams voted no, but for the opposite reasons. The clean bill, as Mr. Trimmer wants, is nothing more than a blank check given to the school districts. It had no reforms in it. It had nothing for outcomes in it. All he wants is a blank check. Senator Abrams said it would not pass the Senate, and he voted no. He wanted additional reforms in that bill, not less reforms. Mr. Trimmer wanted a blank check, and again, we need accountability, reforms, and outcomes to improve education.
Ed?
Well, that's interesting because that's another quote that he made in the paper. He said that he voted against it because of all of the add-ons. But the point is, that bill wasn't a blank check. That bill told schools exactly how they were going to spend their money, and if they were at 30% LOB, that had to go to tax reduction. It also talked about at-risk funding and where the money goes. That bill wasn't just money handed to the school districts. There were conditions on how they had to use it and what they had to use it for. So that's a mischaracterization of the issue. And if you look at the piece of legislation, you'll understand that. What I am still contending, and I believe, except the very few people in the legislature, there were a lot of arm twisting, but they would agree that that bill had a lot of places that indicated how the money was to be spent. But the point is, I was for the equalization, and I was for the property tax reduction, and it's an unfair characteristic or an unfair accusation to say that I was against that in the mailers.
Next question talks about what is the best way to grow the economy, and could you talk about government's role to allow that, to participate in that? Ed?
Well, I think government does have a role. I don't think what we're doing now is the way to go about it. I don't think not having any income tax on any business at all is going to help us get there, because it took so much out of our revenue, we can't function anymore. And we're going to have to make massive cuts unless we do something else. And I think we have a role. I like the PEAK program, and I talked about that and before, where what we said was that if an employer improves on their employment, hires new people, they would get to keep 95% of the withholding tax from that employee's check that went in, or from their withholding to the state. They got to keep 95%. So they got an immediate reward, and they got a tax break if they created a job. And as long as the job was there, they got that incentive. If the job went away, then they didn't get the incentive anymore. And that's the way to grow the economy, not just give a blanket tax break. And I want to talk a little bit more about the tax issue, if I could. When you look at what the taxes did, we had a tax plan that, and if I've got the right information here, right, we cut taxes for the individuals, for poor people, 0.5%, for the middle class about 1.35%, for the upper class in income about 1.85%. Now, the year after that, the legislature came in, I voted against it, in 2013, cut the standard deduction in half and reduced all deductions for individuals by 25%. And then they said, that's not a tax increase. Now they can accuse me of raising taxes because I voted against a tax decrease. But when they vote to take away deductions, that's not a tax increase. And that's what happened. And that's why there was money when they projected there might be a deficit. They had to go in and get some money through that type of tax increase on individuals because of their deductions. And that's why we ended up with a little bit longer period of time where we didn't have a deficit, but it's still coming true. And the projections are still spot on.
Larry?
Thank you. And the question was, I believe, how's the best way to grow the economy? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. The best way to grow Kansas economy is to keep our taxes low, make sure that we grow our jobs, and make sure that we have people working. We got to make sure that we have jobs, because if we keep our taxes low, get lower taxes, more people working means more revenue for the state. Now, jobs. I know you're going to hear that Kansas has zero job growth. But ladies and gentlemen, since 2011, Kansas private sector jobs have grown 55,000 jobs. That's from January 2011 until September 2014. Our unemployment rate in that same time frame has went from 6.8% to 4.8% and stayed under 5% the entire year. Now, this creates more jobs, more people working, more people paying taxes, means that we have more revenue for the state. It doesn't mean that we can tax them more, because when you start taxing them more, you're going to stop the incentive for the people to create the jobs. Jobs, I talked to the Associated General Contractors. Out in western Kansas, in Garden City, Liberal, and Dodge, they have a three-year backlog in their jobs program for the construction projects. Construction is the first thing that happens when you expand your plant, when you build a motel, when you build a restaurant, but they're 3 years behind. This year alone, the Associated General Contractors have added 5,000 good-paying jobs, and what they credited for that is our Tech Ed program that Senator Abrams introduced and fought for quite a bit. But they credited the Tech Ed program for allowing those students to get a good education, go into college, get a technical degree right out of college, and then they can go to work. So I think that's the best way. We've got to grow our economy by lowering taxes, by creating jobs, and less tax burden on our entrepreneurs.
Thank you. requested a minute to discuss this.
Well, I did vote for the Tech Ed program, so I think that was a good idea. But the point is, you can say we've created 55,000 jobs, but you also have to look at the other side of the coin. How many jobs did we lose during that period? The net increase in jobs since we started this plan has been negative 6,000. We're still behind where we were in 2010. So we're not creating jobs. We lag behind the rest of the region in job creation. So watch what they do with the numbers. You need to know the whole side of the story, not just part of it. And when they talk about new business growth, how many were LLCs and how many businesses do we lose? In other words, what's the net gain? And with unemployment, if you take the household survey and you include people who are relatives that are unpaid and work for a family as part of the people who are working or take them off the rolls, then you've got a reduction in unemployment. But that does not mean that you've got people actually working. Thank you.
1 minute. Larry.
I'd like to respond to that. Ladies and gentlemen, the jobs we had in Kansas, private sector jobs, January 2011, 1,075,000. September 2014, 1,131,000. That is a net job growth. Those are working people. I don't care what kind of common core fuzzy math we're using, we had net jobs growth. The people in Kansas see those jobs growth, and that's what fuels the economy.
Thank you. Next question is Governor Brownback recently announced that he would not sign a letter of support for the Kansas Children's Cabinet application for a grant to provide up to $60 million to expand access to preschool programs to the children of Kansas. What position would you take on accepting federal dollars when it has an effect on Kansas programs? I believe we are turned to go with Larry to start first.
I'm not aware of that program, and I will research that when I get back. But I will say this, that if we're taking federal money with federal ties to it, federal mandates, we have experienced that before. Expanding Medicare, I'm sure we'll get to that, Medicaid, excuse me. Expanding Medicaid is nothing more than expanding Obamacare. And that's the same thing we're talking about here. I'll let Ed explain it because he probably knows a lot more about that program than I do.
Well, the Children's Cabinet is tobacco settlement money that then is given to the states to use for children's programs. And I don't understand why the governor has decided not to do that other than just for political reasons. I don't know. I don't understand the rationale. Those programs help us with early childhood education. They help us with diagnosis and screening. They help us with health care. So they help us with a lot of things. And I don't understand why we're not taking that money. I think we'd be well ahead. But I also want to talk about something else, and that is being pro-life is about being more than pro-birth. And if we are looking at children after they're born and not providing money for programs that are beneficial for them, then I think we have a morally inconsistent policy.
Next question. What do you believe is the best approach for Kansas to develop renewable energy alternatives while at the same time working with those who are already providing more established sources of power? Larry? Or, I'm sorry.
Well, I think we need to encourage all different sources of energy and not just one sector. But I also know this, that, and you'll hear it, I'm sure, about the renewable portfolio. That was for investor-owned utilities only. We put that into place to give an incentive to develop renewable energy, clean renewable energy. Now, you've been told in the negative mailers that I voted to increase your utility rates. The Kansas Corporation Commission is the entity that approves rate increases, and they told our Energy and Environment Committee that only 1.6% of any rate increases could even be attributable to the RPS. And in fact, they estimated that the RPS actually saved the utilities money because their rate of pollution is based on, the rate they're allowed is based on total generation. So if they have clean renewable sources, then it gives them more in the area of the fossil fuels that they're using to generate electricity, and they don't have to have as much pollution abatement on those sources. So it actually saves them money. So I want you to understand, we are doing some things. We're doing everything we can to provide incentives. Now, you're going to hear, well, the wind energy, they get a tax incentive and they shouldn't get anything. They should be on their own. Well, the oil industry's got tax incentives. The pipeline that comes through here doesn't pay a dime in property tax. So, we do give incentives at times to different entities for energy development. I think the state has a role in that, but I can tell you this. If we are bankrupt and we don't have any money and we're facing a $1.2 billion deficit, we're not going to be able to help anyone.
The Renewable Portfolio Standards, are known as RPS, is a mandate that undermines the free market, and the market alone should guide our state's energy policy. This mandate came with an agreement that Kansas would be getting a coal-fired power plant in western Kansas in 2009. Mr. Trimmer voted against funding that coal-fired power plant. The EPA and the courts have not allowed this also to move forward. And Kansas receives no property tax from these entities. We're talking about the wind farms. It's estimated that this loss of revenue is $31 million a year. The federal government ended their subsidies in 2013, and as a result, the Kansas utility customers have seen multiple increases in their utility bills with no increases planned due to the update to mandates. Now, we also hear that that's not true. It's only this amount, not this amount. But what they're not including in the estimate is the cost to generate that constant power, because wind is not constant. Solar is not constant. So we have to include the generation of electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. That also has to be in there. Now, I'm all for using all of our resources to produce energy for our state and nation. That includes our wind, our solar, natural gas, coal, oil, and our nuclear. However, they must stand the test of a cost-benefit analysis. I'm for free market principles, and I oppose federal mandates that drive up our utility costs for all Kansans.
Well, the information about the cost of renewable energy in the portfolio, I don't know where Larry got his information, but I can tell you this, that is not what the Kansas Corporation Commission says, who approves the rate increases. And that's what they told our committee, and that's what I'm going on. They're the ones who decide whether the rates get increased or not and why they get increased. So I think they're the ones that should know whether it's actually increasing your rates. And they actually said it should help that. And secondly, I'm not against any of the other industries, but what I'm saying is the renewable portfolio allowed the investor-owned utilities to generate 20%. We kick-started that. That wasn't a federal mandate, it was a state rule. And I wanted to add finally that I voted for the Holcomb coal plant situation with the RPS the second time it came around, because we had the RPS and we worked out a good agreement. And I think that's one of those that they forget to tell you the whole story.
Larry, did you want to respond further? All right. Our next question, as Larry predicted, we're going to discuss Medicaid, and how it would, the question reads is how it will help over 100,000 Kansans in our rural hospitals, and do you favor or oppose expanding Medicaid? So, Larry, I believe that's yours first.
While Medicaid expansion, which has been proposed by President Obama, may sound tempting, but the reality, it harms the people it's intended to help. Expanding Medicaid means that the patients who are already enrolled in the program, many of those have nowhere else to go. They will be the ones who will be competing for doctors and for coverage, and will put more and more pressure on our existing healthcare system by expanding this. The most vulnerable people and the patients who have the greatest needs are going to be the ones that have the hardest time getting care. You know, Edward Miller, who is the CEO of Johns Hopkins Medicine, warned that putting millions more people on Medicare nationwide would mean crushing demands on our medical centers such as Hopkins, which treat a large number of our low-income patients. And also, if we expand Medicaid, there's an additional cost to the people that have private insurance because of expanding Medicaid. Both Medicaid and Medicare underpay their doctors and their hospitals for their care. And who makes up that difference? The providers make up that difference by charging higher rates to our private insurers. This will cause a dramatic increase in the cost of our private insurance. For Kansas, there was a study done by Aon, it was a risk management company, and they showed that the Medicare cost would increase by $1.3 billion with this expansion over a 10-year period. This is nothing more than Obamacare expansion. Mr. Trimmer wants to expand Medicaid portion in Kansas without knowing the actual physical costs associated in the long term. And I support improving our healthcare system, but not with federal mandates. Therefore, I oppose any extension of the Medicaid and Obamacare in Kansas.
Ed?
First of all, I want you to listen to the data. He just said the risk management group said that it would increase the cost of Medicaid $1.3 billion. We would be getting $3.5 billion from the federal government to pay for the Medicaid. The state would only pay 10% for 3 of the 6 years. So that statistic doesn't make sense. Secondly, if the providers think that that's going to be a bad thing, why did the Hospital Association advocate it, and the Kansas Medical Society advocate it, and most of the physicians advocate it? Now, let's talk about how this really works. We right now have people who cannot get insurance because they make too much money to be on the state's Medicaid program, which is at very low eligibility level. They make not enough money to be on the exchange, so they're left in limbo. We don't get that money back. That's money we pay in taxes. We don't get that back because our governor and our legislature has said, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, what that means now is we have 180,000 people that can't get any insurance at all. Now, he's saying, well, it would be a burden on those individuals and it would harm the patients. Not having any way to get any care at all is not the way to go. That is a real harm to patients. They have no way to get any medical care at all. And the hospitals want it because of this. When they do get care, they wait until it's acute. They go to the emergency room, and the critical care hospitals have to treat them. It's the law. And they have to absorb that cost, and you and I pay for it. And that's exactly why they need this money and why the hospitals want this. It may keep some of our hospitals in western Kansas afloat. They're saying we may lose many of them because they can't afford to continue to provide critical access care for free, and they can't pass it on to many of their consumers because they can't afford it in those areas. So, it is not a win-win for anyone not to accept the Medicaid money. It means poor people can't get health care. It means the industry has got to provide some care, acute care, and pass the cost on to us. No one wins when we do this.
Well, man, thank you. When I spoke of the $1.3 billion, that was the state's share of Medicaid. State share over that 10-year period. Now, in 5 short years, 2020, 5 short years, the federal government can end their subsidy of this program. And then, ladies and gentlemen, open your pocketbooks up, because it must be on you for those 300 and some thousand people, or whatever that number was they quoted. They're on you. The main thing that okay.
You have 1 minute.
The federal government was going to give us $3.5 billion. We were going to pay 10%. That doesn't add up to $1.3 billion. Thank you.
Okay, next question. According to this morning's Eagle, child poverty in the U.S. has hit a 20-year low. As a parent of a journalist, thank you for reading the newspaper. In Winfield, 80% of students at Irving schools have free or reduced lunches. What is the state's obligation and strategy for dealing with this issue?
Well, I don't think cutting at-risk funding is the way to go, and that's what was added to the education bill that I voted to send back to the committee. They added an additional cut to at-risk funding, and it was a type of at-risk that took money away from Winfield, Oxford, Belle Plaine, and Udall schools. It didn't hurt Ark City or Wichita as much, but it did hurt our schools, and I don't think that's how you deal with it, is to cut that at-risk money from schools. I think putting schools in a position where you're going to cut, I want to add this. The Kansas Policy Institute, which is funded, I believe it's funded largely by the Koch Industries, they talked about what they see on the horizon for the state, and that is, they talked about huge cuts to education, borrowing massive amounts of money from the transportation plan, and cutting programs for seniors, veterans, and so on, and to pare down government quite a bit. That's not how you deal with problems that you have in your communities where you have needs. Now, I don't advocate taxing people to death, but there's a point at which, when we've got a tax plan that is out there that cuts taxes with no plan to actually grow the economy, and we are lagging behind the rest of the states. The governor's own economic council says so in employment and all the other economic indicators, 13 out of 14. That's not the way for the state to be able to solve problems like this, to be able to provide free lunches for the students that are in poverty.
I think all children need to have a good, nutritious lunch. That's not the issue. The issue, ladies and gentlemen, is our school systems have found a way to get more money into their schools simply by saying your child's at risk. The at-risk children here in Winfield, there's 1,100 of them out of our 2,300. We get more money because of the formula. Bring more money. That $13,269 that goes into every child's education, part of that pays for your school lunch program. Now, we need to fund our school lunch program. But when we go by and categorize our kids, put a label on them, at risk, to get more money for our schools, I think there's a better way. So, more money, we can take care of that. Let's prioritize our overall budget, put the money where it's needed, and spend it wisely in our school system.
Just a quick point. Schools are audited twice every year to make sure that the free and reduced lunch numbers are accurate and that people do qualify. And so it's not that the schools are gaming the system. We have more families that can't afford, that are in lower incomes. Now, they say child poverty across the country is going down. It doesn't mean it's going down in Kansas, and it certainly doesn't mean that families are doing as well. And when Larry talks about jobs, by the way, he didn't mention that whether those were good paying jobs or not, just jobs. So what we're finding, a lot of people work, can't afford to even meet basic needs.
Next question involves a two-thirds majority of both houses needed to pass a constitutional amendment to change the selection of Supreme Court justices. Do you favor or oppose such a change? Larry?
I believe that's the way that our U.S. court systems are structured, and I believe that's the way we should structure our system here in Kansas. I believe that our judges, and if you see what happened to the Carr brothers the other day, and that decision, we need to change the way that our Supreme Court justices are selected because of the conditions like the Carr brothers and what they went through in our court system alone. So I am in favor of changing it back to the way that our U.S. Constitution requires that our Supreme Court justices are selected.
I think it's wrong to try to capitalize on a terrible incident like that for political purposes, and I think that's what's happening here. Now, what I will tell you is this: the court ruled that there had to be a new trial. It didn't reverse the decision necessarily. It just said they had to be retried, and that then they will determine whether they can still get the death penalty. So they haven't changed the decision yet, and that may not happen. Nola Folston, who tried that, said that it was not, it was not good politically to try to use that. Now, as far as the judge selection, which is the real question here, in 1953, they found that the governor misused his power in selecting judges and did a triple play. You've read about that, which is why the state created a constitutional amendment to do the judge selection the way we have it now. Now, just because we have one case where they're retrying it because people don't like it doesn't mean we should give the governor the right to go back to that system that was ripe with cronyism, and which is why the Kansas voters changed it to begin with.
The next question is, should the legislature reconsider its decision to repeal due process protection, tenure protection for K through 12 teachers? Yes.
Yes, I think it should. Due process is not tenure. Teachers can be fired by a district if the district has sufficient reason to do so. All due process says is after 5 years, a teacher has the right to have a hearing. They can select one hearing officer, the board can select another, and they both can agree on a third. They hear the evidence. If they find in favor of the teacher, they get to stay. If they find in favor of the administration, the teacher goes. Because of that, most teachers do not fight the process. We only had 10 hearings in the last several years. Now, we don't even know of those, how many of those were found in favor of the teacher or not. But the point is, if an administration does their job and documents that a teacher is bad, which can be done. I taught in the classroom for 33 years. You can document that there's a bad teacher. You can go into evaluations, tell them where they need to improve. If they don't do it, you can take that to the hearing and you can get rid of a bad teacher. We do not have situations like in New York where they have rubber rooms where they can't get rid of a teacher, because we have a situation here where we just have due process and that's it. We don't have tenure. And so that's all it was for the teachers. Now, no, that's not local control, and I know Larry's going to say that. The point is, that would still benefit the school districts in this way. Because if a teacher is fired now, and they don't give any reasons, and they don't have to go through a hearing if the teacher requests it, then the district can be sued for gender, they can be sued for age, and they can be sued for ethnicity. A hearing documents the reason why a teacher is dismissed and protects a district legally from those, which is probably why most of the districts haven't gone yet to getting rid of the due process. But there's another thing here too. Larry may say, well, look, a lot of districts are keeping it. You see, if that's the case, and what I said is true, then why did we have to add that amendment in the middle of the night without any committee hearings, without any debate on the floor, and without the minority representatives on the conference committee even being invited to the committee?
Larry?
Thank you. Due process, as a father and a brother of public school teachers, I know firsthand how hard teachers work. That's why I passed pay raises for teachers while I was on the school board. And with that said, I support the increased local control for our Kansas schools. The recent change in tenure for education is a local issue rather than a state issue, and it's a victory for local control. Now, when I go to say local control, I was pleased to see that the Kansas Association of School Boards just put this out. They said the 2014 legislative session brought more authority, responsibility, and accountability to local school boards in the operation of Kansas public schools. It said for the first time in decades, authority is moving towards the local school boards rather than away from them. School board members will have more ability to maintain, develop, and operate local schools as provided by the Kansas Constitution. The boards will have more responsibility for management decisions and will be held to higher standards of accountability. Now, due process, Ed alluded to this, and he was correct. Due process is now a non-issue. And the reason I say that is every district in Kansas, with the exception of 2, and somebody may have some more, I haven't heard any more of that, the exception of 2, have negotiated due process in their existing negotiated agreement. Now, Mr. Trimmer voted against that. He voted against funding our schools, our teacher pay rates, and our local property tax relief. He was supported in this due process by a large special interest group that's giving thousands of dollars over his term, and he did that over the kids, over our teachers, and over our taxpayers. I support funding our schools, putting more money in the classroom, and improving our school district.
Thank you. One of the issues that has come before us recently is same-sex marriage. What is your stance on having Christian ministers having to perform weddings against their belief? Larry, will you be first then?
My number one concern when I was knocking on doors and listening to people, the number one concern was growing our economy, and throughout this campaign, not one person, not one, and I've knocked doors in Winfield, Belle Plaine, Oxford, and Udall, and not one person's brought this issue up as their major concern. I'm focused on making sure that jobs are abundant in Kansas, and then every kid gets a good education, and we have a quality education system. With that said, Kansas overwhelmingly passed a constitutional amendment defining marriage as a union between one man and one woman, and I stand behind that definition.
I believe the question is whether ministers should be allowed to marry. And first of all, I don't think that the state has any right to be telling individual churches what they can and cannot do. I think that's up to the individual church. Now, whether that marriage is recognized in Kansas is also up to the courts now. It's not up to the legislature. They passed a law in 2005, before I was there, for the definition that's in our Constitution that Larry talked about. That maybe, we don't know, that could be ruled unconstitutional. It might be ruled constitutional. If it's constitutional, I can tell you with the makeup of the legislature, it's going to stay that way. If it's unconstitutional, the legislature has nothing that we can do about the issue. Passing another law or passing another constitutional amendment is just another constitutional amendment is just another federally unconstitutional amendment. This is an issue for the courts to sort out, and we're going to have to wait until they do that. And to say that that is an issue that we could bring into this debate for the House seat for the 79th District is disingenuous, because it's not something that you could do anything about. It is a federal issue right now in the federal courts, and like I said, we have to wait to see what they're doing. It's not something that should even be in this debate.
Thank you. Next question. What is your position on school consolidation? And I believe you get to start that one.
Well, I'm against it, unless the school districts decide they want to. You're going to hear, well, no one wants consolidation. But if you cut funding for education, you will starve districts into it. So I'm against consolidation either by mandate, or I'm against consolidation by starving districts into it by cutting funds. Now, there was a mailer that I used 2 years ago, and I've got it right up here if anybody wants to look at it. What I said was that there were wealthy school districts that wanted to cut funding to smaller schools to force them to consolidate. I didn't say it was Republicans. I didn't say it was anyone particular in the government other than wealthy school districts, and it was the governor's commission that said that. And in the hearings, I asked the gentleman who was presenting, I said, what do you mean when you say we need to be more efficient? And he said, well, we need to share administrators. Several school districts need to share an administrator. I said, well, how would they do that? Which Board of Education would that administrator answer to? He said, oh, well, we would need to reorganize the school boards as well so that they would be, able to be one. And I said, well, that's consolidation. And he said, well, we don't like to use that word. Now, what happened then is when we had the funding formula and the court said we had to equalize funding, they used that argument that schools that were wealthy were getting money and poorer schools were being forced into possible consolidations because of lack of money, and that's why we had to equalize. So in other words, what I said at the time was absolutely right. That is why we had to have equalization. And one more time for this debate, I did not vote against equalization and property tax reduction. I voted to send the bill back to committee to get the junk off of it. That is not the same thing. There was a procedure where we could have killed it, and we didn't use that. We wanted to go back to committee to get a better form. So please don't buy that.
Larry?
I came from Douglas, as most of you know. I grew up in Douglas for all my life, went to school there 12 years. And Douglas is a small community. We have a small school district. We were 2A in the school district. We played Burden in school. We played Central Burden. But what happens, ladies and gentlemen, when you consolidate schools is what's happening in our eastern Kansas today. Look at Atlanta. Look at Grenoble. Look at all those cities over there, those towns. When they consolidated into Burden, you lose your community. I am 100% opposed to any forced consolidation of any school district in the state of Kansas. Now, the school districts with local control can make their own decisions. We have one school district here, Renwick School District, who has two schools, two different cities. They're both together. I think that would be something that they are working it well. I've talked to the superintendent and also, not the superintendent, but some patrons from that district, and it works well for them. They have their issues, but they're working it well. Now, talking about cutting taxes and all this, the administration that cut the taxes the most was not the existing administration. The administration that cut taxes the most for school finance was the Sebelius-Parkinson administration. They cut taxes double what has been quoted, has been cut, but they also did it 7 different times.
Ed?
Well, the cuts, I don't know where Larry's getting this information. The governor has made the largest cut to education in state history. Sebelius and Parkinson did make minor cuts to education, but remember, they weren't huge cuts to education. They didn't do it 7 times. I don't even know where he's coming up with that figure or how he's arriving at that. But I will tell you this, what they did do was create a 1-cent sales tax for 3 years to get us out of a problem so we didn't have to massively cut education, and we get dogged on that, and then the governor turns around and makes that permanent. So, really disingenuous on that issue.
1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, that 1-cent sales tax was the largest tax increase in state history. It hurt the people, that senior citizens, it hurt the low income the worst. So it was the largest tax increase in state history. And the funding that was cut 1 time versus 7 times or multiple times was double. Multiple times was double the overall amount that was cut by the Republican administration.
Thank you. Next question is, do you support the Common Core standards for Kansas students? And I believe it is Larry's turn.
The ultimate goal of Common Core is to have every school district follow the national standards. This is a failed educational approach and it will undermine our educational quality and choice. The states and our communities, and our local communities, know better how to design standards based on their students and their parents' needs a lot better than our Washington bureaucrats. You know, Common Core is bad for our teachers who have little control in the classroom. It's bad for the parents who have little say over our children's education. And it's especially bad for our students with a one-size-fits-all educational policy that assumes every student learns the same way. When we have a special ed student over here and a gifted student on the other hand, and you try to make that policy work with a one-size-fits-all, ladies and gentlemen, teachers, you know better, it doesn't work. Other concerns include the data mining, where personal information is collected by students and stored in our national data mine. You know, there's Sandra Stopsky, I believe that's how to pronounce her name. She's a professor at the University of Arkansas, and she served on the committee to validate Common Core standards. And what she said, the standards dumb American education down by 2 grades worth. Some of our states would have to move their standards backwards to comply with Common Core standards. Common Core, much like its predecessor, No Child Left Behind, is a failed education approach. We should increase our local control, such as the School Board Association said we should, to allow our parents and our students to have more input in the education, to allow our teachers to do what they love to do, and that's teach our children rather than teach to the test. The Kansas School Board, again, I think that was overwhelming, a great article when they said they approved local control for this. Again, Mr. Trimmer's going to tell you he approves Common Core, and I'm on the other side of that issue.
Again, I think we need to get to the whole truth, and you really need to understand the issues. I want to talk about the Business Roundtable. It's companies like 3M, Archer Daniels Midland, Alcoa, Boeing, the Dow Chemical Company, General Mills, Harley-Davidson. And listen to what they had to say about what Mr. Alley just told you. They said, contrary to the characterization recently adopted in the recently adopted Republican National Committee resolution, the Common Core state standards are not national educational standards. In fact, they are the opposite. The standards were designed by the states and allow for each state to develop, tailor, and implement them based on their specific needs, a clear sign of respect for state and local control over education. Now, the military also approves of Common Core standards. And why? Because all the consortium, not the federal government, the consortium of states that created these said was that we're going to agree that certain concepts like division, long division, needs to be taught, say, at 3rd grade. So that if somebody moves from state to state, their child will not be left behind because the state's in a different place. Now, the Obama administration unfortunately said that you could use the Common Core standards or No Child Left Behind or something else, but you had to have some standard for evaluating your students. Now, that is not a federal mandate, and they're trying to construe that into a federal mandate, and that is not true. Now, you can look at some of the standards I've got up here. It doesn't teach to the test. The standards simply say things like, the student would produce clear and coherent writing in which the development, organization, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. Grade-specific expectations for writing types are defined in standards 1 through 3, and they talk about what they want to see the student know. The state creates their own test, the federal government doesn't do it, and each district can decide how they're going to teach that. Talk to the teachers in the room. Ask them what they think about that, and ask them about the system. They may not like having to do some of the paperwork, but they sure think it's better than No Child Left Behind. And they're trying to characterize this as No Child Left Behind, which was, under the Bush administration, a top-down, teach-to-the-test system, which did fail miserably. We haven't even started this yet. We've only done experimental tests in the state of Kansas, so we don't even know whether this fails or not. You can't make that claim. But the state had KU develop the test, and we're working on those to make this a better system.
You know, Common Core was implemented because the governors wanted out of No Child Left Behind. And so the legislature, the Kansas House, was never informed The result will be $200 million will be needed for the implementation of Common Core, implementation of that process that has never been vetted. There's been no pilot program, no studies done or tested. Our voters and our parents did not see the strength or the weaknesses of the program. No studies have ever been done. Ladies and gentlemen, Common Core is wrong for Kansas. We need to bring the test to Kansas. We need to make sure that Kansas standards are what we're teaching in our schools, not something that's developed in a classroom or a conference room in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
First of all, you can't evaluate a system before it's implemented, and we've just implemented it, so we will have time to evaluate it, and we can make corrections in it. Also, when Mr. Alley talks about the fact that Common Core standards, is actually teaching to the test or causing us to have to, do a federal test, that's wrong. The state is creating its own test. Kansas University is creating the test for the State Department of Education. And the State Department of Education did talk to the legislature about this. They did know about it, but they have the ability, they have the right under the Constitution to have general governance over the state and over assessing students. And that's what they were doing, exercising their authority. We have the right to review, and we had hearings on it. But you know what? None of the committees in the state and the legislature chose not to unfund Common Core because the majority of legislators saw in the hearings and with the information that it was not a federal process and that we did have control and that the State Board of Education did not overstep their bounds.
Thank you. I had a very specific question, and I wanted to check with them, and I believe they both agreed that it's probably not something that they would discuss at this point, so I won't ask that question. And at this time, it is getting past actually the time we were supposed to quit, so it's time for our closing arguments, and so we will let each of you speak to those. I believe we had Ed go first at the beginning, so we're going to ask Larry to give his closing comments.
Well, I think it's been a robust debate this evening. Thank you all for coming out again. This was a very good crowd this evening. I want to thank Representative Trimmer, the Chamber, and the Courier, and both the Chambers, Ark City, and Winfield.
Larry, I'm going to interrupt just for a second and say I forgot to put in Cali First as one of the sponsors, so let's make sure we include them in our comments because we appreciate Cali First support this too.
Thank you, Kelly First. I'm optimistic about the future of Kansas. I believe if we work together, we can accomplish almost anything, and I'm excited about the prospects for our state. I want to see our growing economy, and so our kids and our grandkids no longer have to move out of state for their opportunities. I want Kansas to have the best schools in the nation that are equipped to train the leaders of tomorrow. I was talking to a gentleman on the door the other day, and he says, look what Kansas has done in the past. The aviation industry, the Pizza Hut industry, Chrysler, all of these were created in Kansas education. What inspired those children to go as far as they did? That's what we need to make sure we're training those leaders for tomorrow. A decade is a long time. Mr. Trimmer's been in Topeka for 10 years. During his 10 years, we've seen government expand, we've seen state spending expand, we've seen our state budget grow by 40% just in these first 5 years. Taxes have increased, population decreased, jobs left the state, education budgets were cut, and our young graduates left the states for opportunities elsewhere. The 79th District deserves a better and more effective representation. We don't send our elected officials to Topeka to vote no. We need a representative who can identify the issue, propose a solution, and work with these fellow representatives to implement that solution. I spent 10 years on the school board, and when I came in a district, we didn't have the funds to pay the bills. We had to use no fund warrants to get by that first year. The board continued to work together, and we had a diverse group on our school board, but we worked together to solve those problems. 10 years later, our district had grown from 700 and some students to over 900 students. We had worked together to build a new classroom and a new education center for our schools. And when our teachers came and asked for a 4% raise, we were able to give them a 5% raise. This is what's possible when you have an effective board that works together to seize the opportunities. You know, one of the most rewarding times of my life was the 40 years I spent as a wrestling official. And we would work with all kinds of student athletes. I had the opportunity to officiate 37 straight state championships, and I've acted as head official on several of those. And one of the responsibilities of the head official of the state wrestling tournament is to assign the actual official that's going to work the individual state championship matches. So the qualities we use when we select these officials are honesty, integrity, experience, not influenced by outside sources, able to listen and take criticism, but most of all, you want the ability to make the right call at the right time. And we need that same quality in our officials in Topeka. And you can count on me to act. I won't complain about the other party, and I won't blame them. I won't act. I will act, and I will make that right call. You know, it's time to end the partisanship and the gridlock. It's time to grow our economy, fund our schools, improve the quality of life for all Kansans. You know, I have friendship and support of every senator and representative surrounding the 79th district. And I can and will work with our regional delegation to improve our district and for our state. On November 4th, it's your turn to select the elected official to work for you and to represent you in Topeka. And I'm humbly asking you for your vote on November 4th. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Mr. Alley said something at the last forum that I really believe in. Actions speak louder than words. And I think if you've seen the mailers, you've seen what kind of representative that Mr. Alley would be. I've been accused of raising taxes when I voted against the tax plan. That's not raising taxes, that's a misinformation. Voting for raising your electrical rates because of the RPS, which isn't true. I have been accused time and time again of not getting pay raises for teachers. I've always supported that. My vote on the education bill, again, was not to kill the bill. It was to send it back to conference committee and get a clean version. I voted and supported the bill when it was a clean bill and didn't have some of the bad cuts that were in the bill. They talk about being the father of failed ideas. If they say, I've left them behind, and Ed Trimmer left us behind to please his party bosses. Now, if that isn't political, I don't know what it is. Now, I know Mr. Alley's going to tell you after this, well, I have no control over those ads. Precisely. Because when you get to Topeka, I've watched it time and time again. Those people get called in that win, that, you know, he's willing to take this help to get elected. When those people get to Topeka, they get called into the speaker's office and they tell them, remember what we did to your opponent, and if you don't do what we tell you to do, we'll do it to you. I've seen it time and time again. I've heard it from Republicans over and over again. Excuse me, please. Let me finish.
Let's give him some.
What I'm saying is that when you run negative ads, that's an indication of what kind of a legislator you're going to be. You can't be bipartisan when you stand in the playground and call people names. And that's exactly what's happening here. Now, I do have a good vision for Kansas, too. Larry and I don't disagree on that. I have a vision that we have a great education system, but we can't do it by starving it. And we can't do it by cutting programs that we need to make the education system better. Larry talked about career technical education. I voted for that, but you know what? We still haven't funded it at the level that we said it needed to be funded because we don't have the money. So that's an example of where you can't promote that dream unless you take the reality, you actually do what it takes to get there. You know, I want a fair, equitable tax system. I don't want the poor and the middle class to be burdened by the most tax increases by taking away their their deductions, while wealthy people get most of the tax breaks and then don't have to provide anything for that. Now, I'm not for taxing people, but I want fairness in the tax system. And I also want a state that's going to provide good roads. It's going to provide essential services, police and fire and protection. We need programs for veterans. Our senior centers, the meals program for seniors have been cut. And one of the things we didn't talk about tonight that's very, very important is health care. And we have a program right now that the legislature voted for is to put health care, Medicare, in the hands of a state compact. And that means that we get less money, the money can be borrowed from, and it puts your money at risk. The other thing is we don't have a way to administer that. It would have to be put into a CAN care system, which has been a disaster. Those aren't ways we improve the state of Kansas. I have a dream to make the state better. I was in education too. I know what it takes. And I know it takes somebody that wants to have a dream, have a goal to get something good done, but also have the wisdom to know how to get there. I hope you'll vote for me on November 4th. Thank you.
We appreciate the crowd that we've had this evening. The Chambers and the Winfield Publishing and the College First all are very happy to have you here. I'd like to thank the two candidates. Appreciate the honest conversation back and forth, and wish both of you good luck. Only one will win, but I wish you both good luck.